Act 5 is perhaps the bit that Euro enthusiasts like best. It's the sort of apogee of European integration. It covers the Single European Act of 1986 and the Maastricht Treaty of 1992 and the historic partnership between President François Mitterrand of France, Chancellor Helmut Kohl of Germany, and the President of the European Commission, Jacques Delors, all of them in office from the early to mid-80s to the mid-1990s. Despite the achievements of the Giscard-Schmidt years in the 1970s, there's a sense by the early 1980s that European integration has somehow become becalmed, that in particular the economies of the EEC are not doing as well as they might be, not in comparison with the United States, not in comparison with Japan, seen then as the great challenger, much as China is now. And one of the dysfunctions that European leaders identify is a rise of a form of protectionism between the member states. They're supposed to be in a common market, yes, but nation states are beginning to multiply different devices, legal devices, rules and regulations within national contexts to protect their own favoured producers. For example, by subsidising airlines or car manufacturers whose continued existence is seen as strategic or necessary to employment. And these practices, it's felt, distort the whole free trade ethos of European integration. So one of the proposals that's put on the table in the early 1980s, and it's actually initially a British initiative, is to get rid of these so-called non-tariff barriers and to establish not just a common market free of tariffs, but really a single market. That is, a market in which a producer or a supplier of services in, say, France, would be able to produce and export on exactly the same terms, the same regulatory terms, to the UK, to Germany, to Holland, to Italy, to Greece, new member state in 1980, to Spain, will be a new member state in 1986, to Portugal, will be a new member state in 1986, and so on. And this is the idea that comes into place in the Single European Act, signed in 1986 and into force on the 1st of January 1993. The Single European Act aims to end so-called non-tariff barriers, that is, national rules and regulations which in practice discriminate against European imports. Non-tariff barriers also include, for example, procurement practices, the idea of only offering government contracts to national producers. Out they go, at least in principle, with the Single European Act. So, in principle at least, or unless the Commission chooses to make an exception, so too out go the subsidies that member state governments had been accustomed to give to their favoured national producers. I gave the example of car firms or airlines a few moments ago. The Single European Act also aims to widen the common market to include not just industrial goods, not just agricultural goods, but also services. And this is something which obviously the British, with their very, very service-based economy, are particularly keen on. So if the Treaty of Rome created the so-called common market, what the Single European Act created was the single market. And it's also underpinned by a series of rules about the freedom of movement of people, the freedom of products, the freedom of movement of products, the freedom of movement of capital, to create a much more competitive market, both of goods and services, but also of labour. And certain protected labour markets were opened up to European citizens. You didn't necessarily, for example, have to be a French citizen to work for the French post office. Why should you be, after all? Similarly, qualifications for individuals to work in hospitals or in universities were relaxed to allow European immigrants to work for these institutions, so that far more Europeans, for example, came to work in British universities, and to a degree vice versa, than had been the case before, because they weren't blocked off by an insistence on purely national qualifications. That's the Single European Act. It's a British initiative. It's supported by Margaret Thatcher, British Prime Minister at the time, but it's willingly accepted and taken forward by Commission President Delors, by François Mitterrand, by Helmut Kohl and by the other European leaders. The Single European Act also puts into reverse one aspect of the de Gaulle legacy, which we looked at earlier. For the first time, qualified majority voting is accepted on the Council of Ministers. That is to say, member states can be put into a minority under certain circumstances in the Council of Ministers if sufficient other member states agree on the proposal. But this was only applied under the Single European Act to a quite limited range of single market proposals. Now, closely linked to the Single European Act, but in some ways much more ambitious and much more political, is the Maastricht Treaty of 1992. The link is fairly clear. If the Single European Act has made life easier for European businesses, with the hope that they'll be able to operate in a big single market like American businesses, the obvious next step would be to create a single currency. So instead of having to bother about currency risk, European businesses could operate with the currency that became known as the euro. A further impetus to the notion of a single currency was given by the French, who weren't all that keen on the very strong hegemonic position that the Deutschmark was taking among the European currency markets. Here's Europe's anchor currency. All the other currencies have to define themselves, define their values in relation to it, define their interest rates in relation to it, and yet the body that's setting interest rates for the Deutschmark is, of course, just the German central bank, and it has only German interests in mind. Wouldn't it be better, think the French, if there was a single currency in which all the member states could have an input on monetary policy and on interest rates? Well, not surprisingly, the Germans are a bit hesitant about this. After all, the Deutschmark is the symbol of their economic achievement since the war years. So they're very keen, really, to keep the Deutschmark until 1989 and German unification. And that's really rather a game changer, because suddenly Chancellor Kohl sees the opportunity to unify his country and picks it up and runs with it very fast. Faster, really, than his European partners would have liked. But he's very much aware at the same time that he wants to bring his European friends along with him to accept what's going to be a new and more powerful Germany. And he's prepared to make quite a lot of concessions in order to do that. And one of those concessions is going to be the single currency. The single currency, the agreement on a series of steps towards the euro, is, if you like, the centrepiece of the Maastricht Treaty of 1992. But it's not the only part of the treaty. The treaty also sets out the ambition to create a common foreign and security policy and to create a common justice and home affairs policy. After all, the argument goes, it makes sense for European countries to act together in this new and rather unstable context of post-Cold War Europe. Just as it makes sense, if they're going to have free movement of people, to establish some common justice and home affairs measures, particularly in relation to migration. So the Treaty of Maastricht ends up with effectively three pillars, as they're called: justice and home affairs on the one side, common foreign security policy on the other, and at the centrepiece, the economic community with which was created in 1957. As you probably know, the British were rather uneasy about Maastricht, and in particular they chose to opt out both of the single currency and of the Declaration of Social Rights, the Social Charter, which was supposed to run parallel to it and to the single market. And that was the position of John Major's government, and he was eventually allowed this opt-out by his European colleagues in the course of the Maastricht negotiations. These are really a high point for Europe. Both Mitterrand and Kohl are rather triumphant at the end of it, and the Maastricht Treaty expresses this sort of balance that I've talked about earlier between the economic, because the single currency is very much an economic project, and the political. Again, part of the point of Maastricht is to tie in this great resurgent Germany to a European structure rather than have it on the loose on the European continent. Maastricht is a high point, not least in European public opinion in relation to what has become the European Union. European integration is perhaps never again as popular as it was in 1991 to 92. After 92, Europe enters a zone of some difficulties.